Okay, so then we're recording. Thank you everyone for joining today for this second showcase that the committee is organizing. On the behalf of my co-chair, Rehan, please accept his best regards and also best regrets that he is not here today because he's traveling for the moment out of Hong Kong. We're having Anna Dzidzic here today, a good colleague of mine who is a postdoctoral fellow in comparative constitutional law at Melbourne Law School. She's going to present her book today, which is titled as Foreign Judges in the Pacific. The book is actually about the use of foreign judges on foreign on courts and constitutional jurisdiction in 9 different Pacific states. But what I find very, very interesting is that Anna uses actually detailed empirical research, legal analysis, combines it with legal analysis and constitutional theory to trace their impact in those 9 legal systems. She will tell us a little bit more about this in her presentation. As I said, she's a postdoctoral fellow at the Melbourne Law School. Her research is in comparative constitutional law and judicial studies. But she also explores constitution making and design in context of legal pluralism. We also have 2 discussants. The first one is Rohit Dey. For the purpose of gender balance, the first one is going to be a male. Rohit Dey is from the Yale University. He's a lawyer and historian of modern South Asia. And he focuses especially on legal history of the Indian subcontinent and the common law world. His research is also on modern South Asia, global legal history, law and society, law and colonialism, British Empire, and so on. And the third one is also Erin Delaney. She's, of course, well known from the Northwestern University, professor of law. Her research is actually around constitutionalism in comparative perspective. She focuses on federalism as well and judicial design. She was a federal scholar in residence at Zurich, a very good institute to be at. In Bolzano, she also held a Fulbright visiting research chair at the McGill University. She also held research fellowships at Edinburgh University and the Free University in Brussels. So the rundown for today is that Anna is going to give us a short presentation of her work for maybe 10 to 12 minutes. And then we're going to hear from the discussants and then a reply from Anna. And then we're going to open the floor for Q&A. And yes, I'm from the University of Antwerp and I'm your moderator for today and the co-chair of the ICONAS New Directions in Scholarship. So Anna, please go ahead.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Maya. Just let me try and share my screen now and get that out of the way. Whoop. Okay, is that okay, Maya?
Looks perfect.
Okay, thank you so much. Okay, so thank you so much, Maya, and to ICONS for organising this panel. It's a great honour to be selected to discuss my book as part of this fantastic series. And thank you to everyone for joining us. It's kind of a difficult time to be focusing on academic research, but I appreciate your interest and your presence here. So I've been asked to open this panel with a 10-minute introduction to my book, Foreign Judges in the Pacific. I'm going to begin by setting out what I mean by a foreign judge, then outline how foreign judging works in Pacific states, and then sketch out the framework I developed for analysing and understanding foreign judging. Given the time, this will obviously all be in overview form, but I'm very happy to delve into the details in response to questions or comments. So to begin with the phenomenon of foreign judging, the global norm is that by law or practice, the judges on courts of constitutional jurisdiction will be citizens of the state they serve. However, in the Pacific, along with around 25 other jurisdictions across the world, foreign judges sit on domestic courts and regularly determine constitutional matters. So the use of foreign judges is a significant point of difference, I think, between judiciaries of the world. It prompts a series of questions that are relevant, I think, to all courts and all judges, and which have not been fully explored in comparative constitutional studies. These include questions like, does the nationality of a constitutional judge matter? And if so, why does it matter? Does it affect how judges decide cases? Does it affect their independence and impartiality? Does it affect the legitimacy of courts? In other words, what is gained and what is lost when some or all of the judges hearing a constitutional case are foreign? In the book, I define a foreign judge as a judge who is not a citizen. Generally, a foreign judge is also someone who, prior to his or her appointment, was a member of a different national legal community. There are, of course, examples of judges where this definition doesn't really fit. And there are other dimensions of foreignness that are that relates to citizenship. So foreignness is, of course, a relative concept. You can define it against whatever is considered to be home or familiar. My definition is a state-based understanding of foreignness, which I think is justified because constitutional law itself is state-based. It kind of begins and ends at state borders. I choose to focus on foreign judging in the Pacific. The Pacific region, I think, is often excluded from comparative constitutional studies, even from studies that claim inclusiveness of the global South. The book proceeds on the basis that the constitutional experiences of the Pacific are worthy of close attention in and of themselves, but also that they have much to contribute to comparative constitutional studies. And this includes constitutional innovations and diverse experiences, of which foreign judging is just one. The book focuses on the 9 independent states of Fiji, Kiribati, Nauru, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Tonga, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu. They're all common law countries, they're all post-colonial countries, and they're all classified as small island developing states. Upon independence, they adopted written constitutions with strong form judicial review by ordinary courts and apex courts of appeal. All of these states are legal pluralist in that Indigenous customary law coexists with statutory and common law. So foreign judges have sat on Pacific courts since independence, and in this they continued a colonial practice. I was interested in recent and contemporary experiences, so the data in the book focuses on the 2 decades from 2000 to 2019. So during this period, 302 judges sat on the courts of constitutional jurisdiction across the 9 states. Of these, 225 were foreign judges and 92 were citizen judges. 34 of these judges served in more than one of the 9 states. So the ratio of foreign to local judges varies across the 9 jurisdictions. So in Nauru and Tuvalu, which are the 2 smallest states in the region, all of the judges are foreign. In other states, the ratio is between 69 and 95% foreign judges, and Papua New Guinea has the lowest proportion of foreign judges with just 26%. So across the region, just over 3/4 of all judges on the relevant courts are foreign. But numbers, as we know, don't always tell the whole story. Importantly, only some foreign judges are resident full-time judges. So courts of appeal in the region all sit part-time, and foreign judges on those courts will fly in to visit for a couple of weeks for sittings before returning home. Some foreign judges are acting judges appointed to hear particular cases, and many foreign judges are appointed on short-term contracts of 1 or 2 years. So this means that one local judge might serve alongside a kind of succession of different foreign judges who are filling just one judicial position. So where are the judges from? Over the case study period, all foreign judges serving in the Pacific were from Commonwealth countries with common law legal systems. Across the region, 31% were from New Zealand, 31% from Australia, 21% from Sri Lanka, and 6% from the United Kingdom. 15 judges were recruited from within the Pacific region itself, and 6 were from African states. Again, there's considerable variation between the different Pacific states in relation to the nationality of their foreign judges, which I should kind of show on this slide. There are reasons why Pacific states favour particular donor states, which I will skip over for now in the interest of time, except to note the influence of colonial and regional connections, and Australia and New Zealand kind of fit into both categories, and to say that intra-regional exchanges of judges within the Pacific are increasing, as are connections between countries of the Global South. The professional background of judges also varies. So roughly 42% were serving judges in their home jurisdiction, 24% were retired judges, another 28% were recruited from legal practice, so they're lawyers in their home jurisdiction. And in terms of gender, only 16 of the 225 foreign judges serving over this time were women. In addition to identifying who the foreign judges are and how many there are, the book analyses the legal frameworks and practices for appointing, remunerating, and removing foreign judges. For now, I just want to note 2 key findings. First, that foreign judges is a somewhat precarious practice, both for judges and for courts. The turnover of foreign judges is high, many serve only temporarily, tenure is insecure, and foreign judges are affected not only by the laws and policies of the Pacific state, but also their home state and external donor organisations. The conditions of service of foreign judges differ. The second point is that the conditions of service differ to that of local judges, whether by express legal provision or by practice. Whether that different treatment is justified because foreign judges are in fact different to citizen judges is a kind of theoretical question that I turn to consider in the next part of this presentation. So, does it matter whether a judge is a citizen or not, and why? To answer this question, I considered the kinds of qualities that are associated with citizenship and then assessed their significance to judging in courts of constitutional jurisdiction. So I suggest that there are 2 qualities associated with citizenship. First, citizenship implies membership, which brings with it concepts of belonging, allegiance, and genuine connection between an individual and a country. Secondly, citizenship is an aspect of personal identity, in that the peoples of a nation claim a distinctive identity informed by a shared history, place, custom, and language or languages. It's important to emphasise that these qualities are not essential to citizenship. It's easy enough to imagine a person who, while not having the formal status of citizen, still has a genuine connection to a country or identifies as a member of that country. Long-term resident non-citizens and members of a diaspora are kind of 2 examples of that. The point is that citizenship serves as a kind of proxy for these values. It's assumed that citizens have these qualities and that foreigners not only lack these qualities, but have these ties of membership, belonging and identity to a different country. So taking these qualities at a level of abstraction, I suggest that there are 3 ways in which citizenship affects the role and practices of a constitutional judge. It's on this slide, I just jumped over, there we go. First, membership and identity imply knowledge of the national law and the community in which it operates, and I think this is important to adjudication. Secondly, membership implies a closeness to the national community, while foreignness implies distance, which has implications for judicial independence. Thirdly, nationality can serve to connect judges to the state and its people, conferring a kind of representative function on judges. In the book, I devote a chapter to each of these and explain how they play out for foreign judges in the Pacific. For now, I'll just give you a very brief overview of each of these points, and we can, of course, talk further in discussion. So in relation to the first point, which is knowledge, I argue that the use of foreign judges does have an effect on how courts approach the task of constitutional interpretation and adjudication. Foreign judges face what I call a knowledge gap, in that generally speaking, they will not have the depth of knowledge about the legal, social and political context of the Pacific nation that local judges have. I also say that foreign judges have a knowledge reach, in that their knowledge will extend beyond local circumstances to encompass knowledge and experience in their home jurisdictions, and perhaps other jurisdictions in which they've served. I argue that these two dimensions of knowledge brought by foreign judges can be traced in the constitutional jurisprudence of Pacific courts, which by and large take a quite textual approach to constitutional interpretation and prefer to draw on common law principles and values rather than Indigenous customary law. The second point considers the implications of membership and distance for foreign judges' independence and impartiality. This is an interesting question because in relation to international courts, the debate is often about whether a judge from a country is biased towards their own country. In relation to domestic Pacific courts, this issue is framed very differently. Foreign judges are seen as removed from the personal and political connections of the small community and therefore as more impartial than local judges. While this is a common claim, I think it is a very problematic one because it suggests that local judges' impartiality is inevitably compromised by the membership of the communities they serve, which is both unfair and really quite damaging. The attention given to this justification for foreign judging overlooks a far greater threat to judicial independence, which is that foreign judges typically serve on short renewable contracts and, by virtue of their lack of formal membership of the community and the state, are vulnerable to arbitrary removal from office. And this can occur by non-renewal of their contracts. They can just stop being invited to sit on the Court of Appeal, or governments have even used their immigration powers to deny entry or expel non-citizen judges. The third point explores the relationship between courts, judges, and the communities they serve. And there are many ways this connection might be expressed. I use the concept of representation. The significance of allegiance to the state is examined through the formalities of representation, that is, by the procedures by which a person is given authority to act as a judge and held accountable in that position. So I think about things like the oath of office, the appointment procedure, and how they kind of confer both authority, but also provide a mechanism of accountability to the people and the state. The idea that judges speak for or represent certain values or constituencies in the course of constitutional adjudication provides a way to examine whether foreign judges might come to speak for particular values or concepts and what those values might be. The expressive function of the judiciary is examined by considering the value placed on a judiciary that represents, in the sense of reflecting or resembling the society it serves. And here, obviously, foreign judges, the presence of foreign judges is a way that courts are particularly unrepresentative of the community that they're serving. In each case, I argue that the circumstances of foreign judging limit the extent to which foreign judges are understood to be authorised by, accountable to, speaking for, or reflective of the people and or the state. Instead, greater emphasis is placed on the sense that foreign judges are members of a profession with shared transnational values of impartiality and a commitment to law. And I suggest that this conception of a foreign judge provides the way to tether the legitimacy of foreign judges who cannot turn as readily to other bases of normative legitimacy. So that sets out the key findings and arguments of the book. It races through a lot, and I very much look forward to Rohit and Erin's comments and to your questions and further discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna, for this indeed very brief introduction to your book. I hope Rohit now has more to offer in terms of insights. So Rohit, go ahead.
Thank you so much, Dr. Sajik and Dr. Zazik, for having me on this panel. This book was really a pleasure to read. And what I'm going to do in the next few minutes is to perhaps situate this book amidst sort of larger questions raised in the research of not just comparative constitutional law, but also legal history and thinking about post-colonial British orders. And then I sort of want to end with like 5 sort of directions in which I would like to learn more. And these are questions that sort of come through the project. So let me begin with congratulating Dr. Zazik on a really impressive piece of scholarship. It is one that I can see will become required reading for scholars of political science and constitutional law, but also for practitioners involved in what we sort of broadly term as democratic transitions or post-conflict transitions. But what I want to emphasize here is what the book does is it offers a model of what to do with what sometimes people describe as minor histories or small case studies. It offers a way to think through research methods in constitutional law that either look at sort of big jurisdictions by size or influence, and in the process of studying them, actually sort of canonize these jurisdictions even more, or to resist the rendering of complex constitutional systems into a large data set where you can sort of mine information for norms. It brings in a sort of a strong sense of regional specificity, but also by focusing on the region, pushes us to ask questions about other places. So, for example, Dr. Zazik suggests that the use of foreign judges in the constitutional courts in the Pacific states of Fiji, Kiribati, Nauru, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Solomon Islands, Tonga, Tuvalu, and Vanuatu is exceptional. It's a fast-changing process which will soon sort of pass out given growing localization. But I think actually the work suggests ways in which this is not exceptional. So while currently 30 states follow the practice of having foreign judges, the book reveals that the requirement to have judges to be national citizens of courts is only there for 100 states. That leaves about 48% of the states that are ambiguous about who can serve inside them. If we start looking across the 20th century, the number of courts that have had non-national judges would look significantly larger, particularly in the 50s and 60s in the early period of recolonization. And it might push us to think again about the kind of judgments that have come out from these earlier courts by factoring in the role of having a foreign judge on the bench. Secondly, it is not exceptional for the Pacific, which is a significant region in world history. 3/4 of the constitutional judges of constitutional courts in the region have been international. And it offers us a way to sort of think through our assumptions behind theories of constitutionalism and also of exceptionalism. So what does this book do? It of course brings light to an overlooked region, but does much more than that, particularly because this region has been disregarded because of its size and its sort of less than statehood status. It shows that the constitutional experiences of these small Pacific islands are worthy of close attention in themselves, both as single country studies and at a regional comparative scale. And there are a number of sort of questions that appear throughout the book that are of relevance to scholarship elsewhere, whether these are tussles over unconstitutional constitutional amendments, struggles over ethnically divided societies, questions of free speech, and the kind of precedents, while they play, they play a relatively minor role in the book, make it visible for a much larger audience. More significantly, it pushes us to think through the question of constitutional transitions. So in some ways, through the 20th century, this entire region has sort of been marked as a region in transition, sort of an older colonial logic of being a dependency or a mandate, and then to be an area that is to be slowly coached into self-government. And therefore, a lot of the models that come into this place are often driven by the kind of logics of capacity building, often driven by international donors. And I think what the book does is, by making visible some of the tensions, pushes us to think back to these logics of capacity building and sort of hopefully will be read by these donors and drivers of international transitions. What I found most interesting and perhaps most influential is the sense that this really opens up thinking about what Dr. Zazik describes as the widespread but unarticulated presumptions that undergird constitutional law. And this is not just in the states that have foreign judges, but also in the states that have national judiciaries. The majority of scholarship in political science, legal history, works with focusing on higher courts, really sees domestic judiciaries or national judiciaries as a site where judges play a key representative role. This can be visible in sort of demands that the court reflect the ethnic, linguistic, racial, gender, or even sort of diversity of legal systems within a nation. the kind of challenges of both being removed from the society they're governing, so therefore free of bias, but also signaling a certain kind of belonging to them. It also pushes us to think back at the kind of scholarship on international and supranational courts, which see judges effectively as state representatives, irrespective of how they behave or how they adjudicate, or their kind of like assumption in places like the International Court of Justice that they're largely there for their sort of knowledge of legal science and are supposed to function in a technocratic fashion. So it in a way challenges the mythology of sort of this division between domestic and international adjudication, particularly because we see foreign judges here who are interpreting and applying national law on par with national judges. It is almost suggesting that domestic constitutional adjudication is not a outgrow of national culture, but it's sort of science that relies on these sort of shared principles that cut across jurisdictions and systems. The book also makes a major contribution to the kind of emerging legal histories of the British Empire. Some of this is in sort of simple structural ways. Why do we have what look like modern court systems in this region? And the histories often go back to histories of European settlers refusing to subject themselves to indigenous courts and indigenous customs. Or even when there are courts that administer native custom, these are manned as by both European or Australian judges alongside some native judges or assessors. There's a strong echoes of the Privy Council, which continues to have jurisdiction over some of these states. And the idea behind the Privy Council, of course, was it sort of drew on the powers of the monarch. It was present everywhere in the realm, even though it was physically located in London. And it sort of heard cases across the empire through all kinds of legal systems on questions one could have argued that a judge sitting in London might not have expertise in, whether it's sort of complicated questions of Islamic law or questions dealing with sort of indigenous land title. But this constant refrain in the Privy Council, and there's a quote from Lord Haldane, Viscount Haldane, that Dr. Jajek sort of refers to, is that judges on the Privy Council look for common principles underlying systems of jurisprudence of differing kinds. We're consistently finding that where great broad principles of justice are concerned, you will find them still veiled, but they're only distinguished by technicalities. The same substance that belongs to different systems, the human mind is the same all over. So it's really a kind of invocation to the mythology of there being sort of common legal principles. But through a close study, Dr. Jajek sort of pushes back at some of this, right? So despite this kind of appeal to close legal principles, by studying around 80 judgments, certain things come through. One, that this appeal to sort of universal legal principles essentially shows a great deal of impact of the common law and sort of colonial legacy. Secondly, it shows, and in contrast to what European legal systems often did in colonial sites, a rather limited integration of custom, and I talk about this a little later, and perhaps significantly, a sort of textualist appeal interpretation of the Constitution. So we see a kind of sort of narrative which suggests that the presence of these judges indicates there's a kind of broader world of principles. I can see that a lot of donors and outside observers value this because when they say, you know, universal or abstract principles, they're referring to a certain kind of shared idea of rights or that are ingrained in international statutes and agreements. But what comes out really is a sort of textualist reading of the Constitution, and it's interesting to think why this is so. It's partly, as Dr. Jajek shows, the foreign judge on the court is not necessarily more independent. In fact, the conditions that structure her presence there, the fact that it's an ad hoc position, it's a position that's often renewed, for some cases, a position that comes with a lot of pay and perks and is attractive, actually reduces the ability of the judge to function independently. Secondly, the sort of lack of authority that one can draw from other categories of representation requires judges to constantly justify themselves by sort of turn to textual legalism. And I don't think this is necessarily benign, a sort of benign idea. So if we go back to the Privy Council and look at number of judgments, there's a constant deferral by the Privy Council to the sort of authorities, particularly in the kind of settler colonies of Australia and Canada. The narrative always is that we have to give constitutional text the broadest sort of basis of basic broadest consideration. The burden of proof is really on the other side. And in many cases, for example, dealing with colonial emergencies or detentions, we see the Privy Council constantly siding with the executive. So clearly textualism is not value neutral, and I hope Dr. Isaac will talk a little bit about how this plays out in some of her case studies. Secondly, it's interesting to think about why custom plays such a limited role, given that the kind of basis of common law, both in Britain and in the colonies, was about sort of recognizing and protecting custom, even though it was a kind of invented narrow idea of custom in many sides. So the first reading, of course, is this is some kind of modernizing impulse of the foreign judges, or the idea that foreign judges are hesitant to interfere with local custom. But the text also shows that it's not just the foreign judges who are hesitant about custom, but also that local judges in the Pacific are not engaging with custom in the ways that one would have imagined. And this is perhaps something that might be worth talking about. So there are certain things we assume foreign judges would do, and we also see local judges doing the same. Which ways are the norms flowing? Who is influencing whom? Finally, there's a kind of, we can frame it in different ways, but I would describe it as a kind of legacy of the local empire. So while there's a sort of wide number of states represented amongst these judges, the average judge is a white male Australian or New Zealander judge. So it's worth thinking about what assumptions this figure comes in with. And I just want to give one example, which I think is also a case that should be studied a lot more, is of C.J. Webster's decision on free speech in the Tongan constitutional law case. And my apologies if I pronounced the name wrong, it's Taione versus Tonga. So the question here was the validity of amendments made to the constitutional position of free speech. The original constitution said no law shall ever be enacted to restrict free speech, except in cases of slander or attacks upon the royal family. In 2003, it brings in a range of restrictions to national security, public order, morality, which seem inconsistent with free speech as a whole, but actually look very much like the kind of restrictions that exist in all sort of post-colonial British constitutions. So India, Sri Lanka, Malaysia, Ghana, all have these restrictions. So in deciding this question, Justice Webster has to decide how to, he argues that several parts of these amendments are unconstitutional because they sort of are inconsistent with free speech. And he turns to initially the common law, but then what he describes as constitutional freedoms in a Western sense rather than a Tongan sense to interpret this. And he makes a very curious historical argument that the Constitution of Tonga, which was enacted in the 19th century, was enacted as a kind of bulwark against colonial rule. So the Constitution was enacted to show that Tongans are a sovereign people capable of self-government, and you know, you have to have a constitution because all Western countries have a constitution. This is, of course, Justice Webster's reading of it. But does this mean that Tonga's constitution was a Western constitution? Or does it suggest that Tonga had a kind of autochthonous constitutional tradition that took a particular form at that time? Why should free speech be sort of categorized and preserved as a kind of a Western sense? Isn't it possible to have a kind of Tongan sense of free speech, which would also lead to the same decision? So this is one of many cases that sort of bubble up through the book. And while, of course, they're not the focus of the book, and I think offer a staging ground for many important conversations. So I'm not going to go over all of Dr. Isaac's main findings, but I just want to turn to 5 questions that sort of open up space for discussion. So the first clearly is to think about the Pacific as a space in comparative constitutional law. And here I think it'd be useful to think a little bit more about the legal history of the Pacific. So the Pacific seems to be an international legal space, or a space for international actors in the law for a long period of time. I'm thinking here about the involvement of sort of legal scholars from around the world in constitution making in Fiji and other places. The sort of the Papua New Guinea law schools were set up under William Twining at one point of time, and the kind of movement of legal professionals elsewhere. So to what extent is the fact that this has not been a political question for a long time, relying on the kind of older history of the kind of internationalization of law, internationalization of domestic law in the Pacific in general. The second turns to the kind of, one of the reasons why this question becomes an important one is the relatively strong judicial review in many of these states. A judicial review that's actually stronger than some of the states where the judges come from, be it New Zealand or Sri Lanka. So why is the judicial review there? And there's sort of the kind of answer we have got from a lot of comparative constitutional law scholarship is it's tied to some sort of idea of a certain kind of elite group wanting to preserve their privileges facing democratic transition, Or I'm thinking here about Tamir Mustafa's work on Egypt, the need to sort of reassure, it's a kind of political economy question, the need to reassure foreign corporations, foreign donors, that we will have a certain kind of rule of law. My third point talks about, wants to sort of go back to the idea of the region and think about specifically the kind of larger world of Australian and New Zealand constitutionalism. So while we describe this as common law, how much of this is a kind of Australian, New Zealand common law constitutionalism that is there? And to sort of reverse this, I thought it was interesting to think a little bit about what the judges are traveling with. So if the Australian, New Zealand judges are traveling with a certain vision, why is it that, say, Fiji is bringing in such a large number of Sri Lankan judges? So they form the third largest group amongst the pool. 21% of all judges are from Sri Lanka. And I just wanted to speculate a couple of answers, particularly because Sri Lankan judges refused to or did not participate in the interviews for this. So Fiji is an ethnically divided society, and many of its tussles have been between sort of groups that represent Indians and groups that are political parties that represent indigenous communities, and the judiciary has played a kind of critical role. Sri Lanka is also a society which is sort of dealing with political ethnic cleavages, again, between Indian diaspora, Tamils who belong to a larger Indian diaspora, and sort of Sinhalese who frame themselves as sort of indigenous claimants to the island, right? So is it a coincidence that Fiji turns to Sri Lanka to bring judges in? And here I'm thinking of Sam Daly's recent article in the Law and History Review, where he looks at the role that Nigerian judges play when they serve on constitutional courts across Africa, and in some ways sort of import in a kind of jurisprudence of the coup that they're familiar with, that they sort of evolve in Nigeria and then bring to Uganda and to other sites. So is there a kind of sort of a more detailed story of specific constitutional transfers happening? And I think this opens up a way in which the book engages or complicates Anne-Marie Slaughter's work on global constitutionalism, which is really focused on a kind of equal conversation between judges, whether they're on international courts or at these sort of global conferences. But what we see in this book is that the movements are clearly not equal. There's a movement from certain kind of countries, usually developed countries, to developing ones. So what are they bringing with them? Or more interestingly, what are they taking back? So at least in some of these cases, these judges serve in the Pacific and then go back to their home jurisdictions. Are there ways in which that is it just a cut-off experience, or do these things come in? And finally, this is a book that works on mixed methods, but I think there's a kind of interesting under-discussed core here, which is dealing with the interviews with the judges themselves, which for a variety of reasons had to be anonymized. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit more, especially in an audience like this, as to what you got, what did you see? How did these judges see what they were doing, and how did other judges in the system see what these foreign judges were doing? So thank you, and I know I dropped a lot, so please do not feel compelled to respond to all of these. But I want to underline this is really a book that pushes you to think through a lot of other key questions and assumptions, and it's really a book that must be mined for all the details that are there on many of these countries that remain understudied in part of the kind of global context. So thank you.
Thank you, Rohit, very much. And I hope you had enough time to write down all the comments and questions. Erin, I think it's now your turn.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you for including me. Thank you, Rohit, for your comments. Some of my comments dovetail or really I share your some of your points. So I will try to stay brief. The first thing I would like to do is just say how fabulous the book is. I'm delighted to be here. I'm also thrilled because this is the second volume in the Heart series on judging and the courts. And that is a series that I co-edit with Jamie Lee and Andrew Lynch. And the three of us were absolutely thrilled to get to publish this book in our series. It's fantastic. I get to be sort of reviewer number 2 and be thrilled and excited. So it's a rare occasion. But thank you again, Anna, for the book. So my comments are, I'll keep them brief as they dovetail with some of what Rohit has already said. It's a terrific book. I strongly recommend reading it. One of the things that I particularly like about it is the attention to the careful attention to actual practical workings of judiciaries, right? The amount of work that Anna has had to do to really understand how the contracts work in different systems, the way in which judges are appointed, that kind of fine-grained procedural analysis is incredibly valuable to those of us who study judiciaries and who want to understand how things actually work on the ground. I should note she is also, with Simon Young, co-editing the Cambridge Handbook of foreign judges on domestic courts right now. And so I would flag that to everyone as the next book in this kind of emerging and incredibly important area of research to look at. And I believe that covers 30 jurisdictions or at least. So what I would like to talk about, though, really builds on what Rohit was saying, but from a slightly different angle, which is the field's current interest in the legacy of colonialism and decolonization. And we have seen recently in an editorial in Global Constitutionalism and the invited forward by Karen Alter in Icon, that there is a focus now on decolonizing constitutional law, decolonizing comparative constitutional law, even decolonizing comparative private law with the project coming out of Max Planck in Hamburg. And so what does it mean to think about decolonizing comparative constitutional law, decoloniality, and judiciaries? And so what I would like to ask Anna is to understand more of her normative views going from this book, taking what we have read, and she gestures towards this at the end with some suggestions about how to think more about how to increase or to interrogate the legitimacy of these constructs going forward. But she is doing so really, from within the Western liberal democratic construct. What is legitimacy as she defines it within this construct? And the book is, as Rohit points out, imbued with sort of the sense that this comes from the colonial past and reflects a certain neocolonialism, the role of development agencies, the sending states themselves, expectations of the sending states. And so it's, though imbued with this, it's not exactly clear how to move forward, or how, Anna, you would tell us to move forward out of this. One of the core points that she makes beautifully in the book is this idea of the technocratic expertise in common law, in comparative constitutional law. And it's precisely that which is looking sort of unreflexively at the baseline understanding of law and the rule of law. And Rohit points out a case that I was also going to mention before the Supreme Court of Tonga, exactly this kind of set of assumptions that is built in through the foreign judges about both originalist and textualist meaning, what the goal of the 1875 liberal democratic constitution was meant to be, which was to reflect, a Western outlook. Well, is that something that, is shared now? And I think of Linda Colley's book and the effort with which Western constitutionalism is taken on as a self-protecting mechanism in certain time periods, just precisely to avoid a more robust form of militarized colonialism. So I guess my question then for Anna is, how, she asks what is gained and what is lost by using foreign judges. I would like to know more about who gains and who loses. How can we disaggregate the communities? When she talks in the end about sort of reviving or encouraging legal pluralism, and we think about the role of Indigenous law, well, how does that get operationalized? And one question I have is whether or not, and again, I want to separate the book, which is excellent, from sort of the next projects. One question I have is whether or not your use of nationality and citizenship is too blunt an instrument for thinking meaningfully about a decolonization project going forward. So she opens the book with this wonderful puzzle, right? She says, there's a large Pacific diaspora in New Zealand. Many New Zealand citizens identify as Pacific Islanders and maintain strong links to their home country. Justice Ida Melosi was born in New Zealand to Samoan parents. In 2002, she was appointed a judge of the New Zealand Family Court, becoming the first woman Pacific Island judge in New Zealand. From 2013 to 2014, she served as a judge on the Samoan Supreme Court. The question arises, was Justice Melosi a foreign judge when she sat as a judge in Samoa? And for Anna's purposes in this book, she is, right? Because it's citizenship that's doing the work. But as we start to think about a situation which at the end of the book is a little bit perhaps demoralizing, in that there may be no space for local judges. The project of localization may be too complicated for certain of these jurisdictions. And overlaid with that, Rohit's point about panel effects and whether or not local judges can really function as local judges or can take on the kind of customary or indigenous role that a true project of decolonization might necessitate. Well, what is left if citizenship becomes such a strong marker of foreignness? And, you know, is there space, Anna, to think about representation in ways that is sort of maybe more complex or more individualized as you go forward to sort of operationalize the normative project, which I sense in the book? You're very careful about pointing out colonial legacy. You have footnotes identifying sort of how you understand your role and the questions that custom and indigeneity arise. So I take this as a backdrop that you maybe aren't engaging with fully. So what next is my question. How do you take that potentially that normative overlay that I'm sensing in the project, and then operationalize it given some of the constraints you've put on the project, at least for this portion of the analysis? So I would just add that to the many wonderful comments already identified, and I really look forward to the broader conversation. Congratulations again on a terrific book.
Thank you, Erin, very much on your comments. Now I'm gonna give Anna a little bit more time to than we perceived, I think, because you received really a large amount of comments and questions, so that you can actually reply, if not to all of them, to most of them. So go ahead, Anna.
Fantastic. Well, I'll try my best to reply to at least some of them. And if I miss things, please remind me. But thank you so much to Rohit and Erin. They were both top of my list when I was searching for potential discussants. And I'm so pleased that you got a lot out of the book and made such generous comments. So thank you so much for reading it and for engaging with it. I think some of the questions, as Erin said, kind of overlap. So just let me take a few themes and talk about those, and I'll see if then some of the answers to the more specific questions come out. I'll start with Erin's because it's fresh in my mind, and then go back to Rohit's. But I think that this comment on the limits of citizenship and its combination with a kind of decolonial project is really, really quite interesting and challenging for me. So when I began this project, I did so knowing and being very conscious that I am not a Pacific Islander. I'm not from the Pacific. I'm Australian. I'm an Anglo-Australian lawyer, trained in that position. I felt that consciously, and I really struggled, I think, to work out, well, what am I doing in this space? What am I saying, and what can I say from this position? And I think I came to the view that comparative approaches kind of help in this regard, because I can say, well, I'm putting this in conversation with a Western kind of understanding of what's going on. And I think one of the footnotes that Erin noted pretty much says, I cannot speak for Indigenous ways of knowing. I cannot speak of Indigenous understandings of legitimacy. That's for Indigenous people of the Pacific to talk about. And I do cite, or have read, and I cite a lot of fantastic work and really deep work from Bernard Narakobi, from the former head of state of Samoa, to Puaepi, and got a lot out of their work. So I think that was the limitation I felt around talking about those kind of things. But I think it's important to think, well, what is next? And I think that you're exactly right, that national citizenship and nationality is a limitation. It's a Western kind of construct, if you like, that's been imposed on these states. These states were not states before, they were islands, they were connected to each other, people moved between them. There are Samoan links in PNG, you know, that it's a huge area that was very much a site of travel and movement and conversation, I guess, and that's going back a long time. So I think that if any region, I'm sure that's true of every region, but in the Pacific, this kind of is felt a lot. And you've got Pacific scholars who talk about what it means to move, to migrate, and to be a migrant, say, in New Zealand, but be Tongan in New Zealand, and those kind of questions. So I think this is a great region for thinking through some of those issues as well. I chose citizenship because that was the basis on which the laws discriminate between judges. Not all laws, Papua New Guinea, Fiji, and Samoa, I think, expressly say, you know, use citizenship as the criteria to distinguish foreign from local judges. And I just thought, well, that's as good as I've got at the moment. And when it comes to counting judges, I need some kind of hard rule. Of course, citizenship is always hard to understand. I mean, there's no database of who's a citizen. So a lot of it is guesswork in the end. I mean, I categorize people who were born in Australia and trained in Australia as lawyers and then became judges. I just assume that they're Australian citizens. I could be assuming incorrectly. So there's always this kind of uncertainty about citizenship anyway, in addition to those cases like Ida Melosi, who you know, is a Samoan, but a New Zealander as well. And there are other examples that press on that kind of question. So Justice David Cannings is an Australian, but he's lived in Papua New Guinea most of his professional life. And so he's a foreign judge under the law, but I mean, if you've practiced in Papua New Guinea and you've been on the bench for so long, are you effectively, you know, more of a belong, you know, closer to an insider than an outsider in that regard? So I think that was the limitations that I put on myself, and whether that can kind of change, I think it would have to be, it would look more like a study that follows individual judges rather than the kind of comparison of states that I've been looking at. So I think there's a different kind of methodology that would be required. So I approached this as a comparative constitutional lawyer. I thought, well, okay, we've got states, let's compare states and see what comes out of that. I think if you perhaps follow judges around, you know, if you could just pick some and follow them and work out who they are, where they went, what they came back with, it's a very different kind of project, but also one that might make the national borders and the borders between legal systems a little bit more porous, and in that sense, decolonial. So I hope that kind of gives a sense of some of the different ways that it's possible to think about foreign judging that address some of those kind of questions. I think that point kind of echoes what Rohit was saying about the Pacific as a space. It's a space in which people travel, and I think you can also add into that mix exactly what Rohit said, the international coming into the Pacific and going out of the Pacific, right? And I would just say, yes, there's a whole history of people like Yash Ghai, Jim Davidson, all these international people involved in constitution making at the time of independence, but also later. But I think also what we see is Pacific Islanders going out, and I think that's the other half of the story. So you have judges, Samoan, Solomon Islander judges who have sat on international courts in Sierra Leone, for example, sat on international tribunals. So I would want to resist the coming in, everything comes to the Pacific, nothing goes out again. So it's a complicated story of travel, which I think is fascinating. And it does mean that some of those questions and that hard distinction between what is local and what is foreign begins to break down. And I think that's really interesting to think about. And I was trying in the book to be very careful about that, while also being able to make claims that there is still a sense that, a judge who was from New Zealand, and some of them even said to me, I couldn't find Kiribati on the map if I tried, right? What does it mean for that kind of person to then go to Kiribati and sit as a judge? So there's kind of the easier case of nationality and citizenship, and then this more difficult kind of question. And I think the question Rohit asked about, well, who's influencing who on these panels and how does it work? I really struggled with that question when it came to that chapter 5 on constitutional adjudication, because it's like, well, I can't claim that all foreign judges decide in a particular way and all local judges decide in another way. I mean, judges on different courts do different things. Judges change over time. It's very hard to track that empirically. So I tried to avoid making those claims. And I think in the book, I set out some examples of foreign judges who do engage with custom, who do that, and local judges who don't. So the division again is not quite as clear cut, and I want to resist saying that it is, while also being able to say, well, there's clearly something else going on here, and that the influence of foreign judges can be felt or can be seen in some of these approaches to constitutional adjudication. I think the other point that I appreciated Rohit making was this sense of internationalization coming through, not just in the composition of courts, but in constitution making, and even for the fact of institutions. Why is there strong judicial review, for example? Why are there written constitutions? It might be another question to ask. And I think that when Rohit said, well, is it elites trying to preserve their privilege, or is it, to reassure foreign donors? I think it's more the latter, and reassure not just foreign donors in the future, but British or Australian or New Zealand interests at the time of independence as well. And so you can see that maybe at that time, they were keen to preserve a presence on a court because they have vested interests. I mean, Nauru is an obvious case of Australian interests wanting to be preserved. They have huge mining interests in Nauru. So there is that kind of neo-colonial sense. But I wonder how much that's changed now that time has passed, that there are more Indigenous judges, and I guess the other maybe puzzling point is to think, well, Pacific Island states and governments are the ones themselves appointing foreign judges. Nobody's making them do this. Yes, of course, there's the gift of donor-funded foreign judges, which is hard to refuse if you're struggling with your resourcing of judiciaries. But that's not all the foreign judges. A lot of them are appointed by the Pacific governments themselves. They're paid by the Pacific governments. And so this is not necessarily an imposition. It's not an imposition at all. It's a choice that they are making. And I wanted to be very clear that I don't think this is a bad choice. I don't think that foreign judges are illegitimate. But it's an interesting kind of decision to make. And I was interested in why they would feel the need to make that decision. Is it because there are no local judges? Well, clearly, in some states that might be the case. In others that rely heavily on foreign judges, such as Fiji, I don't think it is the case. I think there are other reasons why the government prefers to appoint predominantly Sri Lankan judges, and they're to do with control over the judiciary and the appointment on short-term contracts primarily. And I think, sorry, I've lost my train of thought. Yeah, so I don't think that it's purely neo-colonial. I think that there are genuine things. And I wanted to make the point in the book too that there are judges that feel this and take it seriously, and that maybe there are ways to improve the practice. You know, if we're going to accept that the practice will continue, and I think it will, what are some ways that we can improve it, rather than say, oh, it's neo-colonial and you shouldn't do it. Rather to say, well, you know, what can we do to make it, to address some of the concerns and the risks that I identify. And I think localisation is one of the answers to that question, to really emphasise the need for investment in local legal professions and local judges to come through. I think that's all I've got. I'm sure I've missed a lot in those comments. Maybe we can return to them in Q&A in response to direct questions, but they were challenging questions. Thank you so much for asking them, and I hope that I can answer them in some way.
No, thank you.
Thank you, Anna. I think it was elaborate enough. Before I open the questions for the public, actually, I will open the questions for the public because they're open already, right? So you received 2 questions in chat while you were presenting and while you were also giving explanations or giving remarks to the questions that you've received from your discussants. In the meantime, others can raise their digital hand if they want to ask their question. But one question is very short one. It's about a percentage of military judges when you were giving us the data, the empirical data in your presentation. And then the second question is from Silvia Soto. The first one was from Cornelia Weiss, and the second one is from Silvia Soto, which is about, she actually has 2 questions. The first one is, does the book look at the legal education of the judges, not just the foreign ones, but the domestic ones as well? Presumably, domestic judges educated abroad may bring their own form of foreignness to the bench and also may cooperate more easily with the foreign judges with whom they might actually share more than one might initially be obvious. And the second question would be, can you say more about the lack of female foreign judges? Sylvia is aware, she knows that in the book you discuss lack of diversity, but yeah, it would be nice to know that that she thinks that those do not fully explain the particularly low 7% figure. And then I'm going to give the word, after you answer those 2, I'm going to give the word to Professor Greve, who was also a foreign judge in Bosnia and Herzegovina. So go ahead, Anna.
Brilliant, thank you. So on the military judges, I'm not sure if that means judges on military courts or judges appointed by a military regime. In any event,
maybe Cornelia wants to former military judges. Okay.
Oh, I see. So judges who were formerly military, had experience
Right.
in the military.
So can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes, we can.
Okay. So I I do know, for example, I saw a call come out to former military judges in the US for a position on one of the areas that that's not in your book. And so I thought, well, isn't that interesting? You know, perhaps that's a feeder. So I wondered if for the areas that you studied, if that was also applicable.
Yeah, not so much. I don't think there's been a huge call. I mean, some of the judges who have taken, who have served in the Pacific have also served on, say, military appeal courts in Australia, but not solely. They tend to be federal court judges or judges who have that jurisdiction alongside other jurisdictions. I'm not aware of any kind of direct call from these Commonwealth countries.
Right, and I'm not asking about a direct call. It just seems that that's also a feeder, and that would be also part of an area to make visible that having those opportunities of being in the military also enable one to then advance to beyond these kinds of positions. And given that the military is a predominantly male institution, I think that needs to be made visible. So I thank you very much. And again, terrific. I very much look forward to reading your book.
Thank you. No, I think that's a really interesting point, and one that I hadn't been aware of because it kind of hadn't come up, but now it has. I will certainly look into it. So Sylvia, thank you so much for your questions. I think you've also hit on something that Erin and Rohit kind of touch on too, that foreignness is not just citizenship, right? And of course, a lot of Pacific Islander lawyers and judges are educated overseas, whether that's overseas in the Pacific region or overseas in Australia, New Zealand, UK, US, wherever, because not every country has its own law school for a start. So a lot have to travel. The regional law school, USP, covers the region, but still it's an experience that takes lawyers outside of their home jurisdiction and puts them into a regional kind of context. So I think that you're exactly right, that domestic judges educated abroad bring a form of foreignness to the bench, potentially, but I would say that they're probably in a better position to mediate it with what they know about local custom and culture and context. I mean, one example of this is the current Chief Justice of Samoa, who was a practicing lawyer in New Zealand before being appointed to the Supreme Court as Chief Justice. He's a Samoan, but he's obviously lived and worked in New Zealand for a long time. Again, one way of thinking about it is it provides a kind of link to mediate or to converse with other legal systems, whether that's represented through a foreign judge or just through the knowledge that you gain from an overseas experience. It also meant that I was careful to define foreignness not to exclude local judges educated abroad. I think that in some contexts you could define a foreign judge as somebody who is educated and practices abroad, but that would exclude a lot of people that I think of as Indigenous or local judges, simply because of those reasons of specific legal education. The lack of female foreign judges. So I agree, and I've kind of done a little bit more work on this in a different context than the book. So there's a lack of diversity in the appointee pool, and you think about a generational and historical lag. So you think that a lot of foreign judges are retired judges in their home jurisdiction, and you think about the number of women judges who were on the bench 20 years ago, and you can see why there's a limited number. Does it explain the particularly low 7% figure? No, I think that there are also issues of discrimination and stereotyping at play amongst Pacific authorities that appoint foreign judges. There's a low number of local women judges as well. And potentially the sense that being an expatriate judge, being a foreign judge is still seen as something men do. I've been reading a little bit about, expatriate employment and how that kind of classification works, and it's very much a male job, in the past at least, and that's the tradition that's come through. So maybe those factors are at play as well.
Thank you, Anna. I'm going to give the word to Professor Greven now. We cannot hear you. You're on mute.
And now?
Yes, perfect.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for this marvelous book and for the precedent comments and question. It is really a very interesting discussion. I just would like to underline two aspects which I thought very interesting and very important for me, and which are different, I think, from the other mentioned points, which are also very important. The first is your study of the rationales to use foreign judges. It was very interesting for me to see how you reached to systematize the reasons for using foreign judges, and then to examine concretely how it works. And we can see that there is no any adequation between the theoretical reasons and the concrete positions of the judges. First of all, for instance, the short-term contracts, which is completely contradictory with the aim to capacity building and exchange between judges and so on. So I think this is a very important point, which runs all over your book from the beginning to the end. And so that's the reason why I think the rationality debate is so important, and that countries and lawyers should think more about the adequation between the aims and the means. The second point I would like to mention, I think I don't completely share your opinion, and that's why I think it's important to mention. It's about the constitutional interpretation. You are very prudent, of course, but finally, I think you are opting in favor of a textual interpretation for foreign judges because of their knowledge gap, because of the lack of democratic legitimacy and the lack of representation. That's true, okay. But I think also that after all, the real interpretation, the real constitutional interpretation starts after textual interpretation or textual analysis. And which is what is very important are the underlying principles, as the Samoan constitutional amendment precises it. So I think that you cannot really understand a constitution if you only read the text. That's if foreign judges can do that, I would say that they can't do their job. And then furthermore, you say that political science has reached the result that foreign judges, if they go beyond the textual interpretation, should behave strategically. But I would like to ask first, why? Probably because of an adaptation to the local situation, the reaction of the other actors. But the other actors are not only the political stuff, you also have people, ordinary people in the street. And second question, what is strategical behavior? In what is it consisting? I would like to give a little example of personal experience in Bosnia-Herzegovina, where all local judges belong to the political elite. The political elite is very nationalistic, because the interest of the nationalistic political class is to maintain very strongly this nationalism and the importance of ethnic criteria, because otherwise perhaps they would be very much contested. But if you go in the streets and you ask people, and if you observe the popular reactions, for instance, demonstrations in the streets and so on, you see that very often social or economic arguments are much more important for people than ethnic belonging. And so if it's forbidden for foreign judges to take account of these considerations, how can you progress? There is no issue. You would all the time maintain this mainstream nationalism. And so it's not very interesting to be a foreign judge in these countries. I'm exaggerating, but it's it's intentionally. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Constance. That's such a great question. And when Erin mentioned the Cambridge Handbook on Foreign Judges, I should acknowledge that Constance and Jens, who are both in the audience, are authors in that project. So to be clear, I'm not advocating that foreign judges should take a textualist approach. I was trying to say that's what I see them doing. And I think that there are the limitations that you've just identified clearly yes. with that approach. So I think that the resort to textualism is not good for the development of constitutional law. I mean, I think that you're exactly right that, you know, interpretation starts with the reading of the text, and then you need to invoke principles. But I think part of the role of the constitutional judge is to set out that reasoning as well. So and this doesn't happen in all cases, I don't want to mischaracterize what's going on in the Pacific, but if a judge, any judge, kind of stops at the text and doesn't then go that step further to explain the principles that they see underlying that, then maybe they have only done part of the job that they need to do. And so I see the retreat to textualism as a potential problem for foreign judges. And it may be that it relates to something that Rohit said, you know, what are these judges bringing? And is there a particular Australian or New Zealand approach to interpretation and constitutional adjudication that's coming through? And as an Australian, I can definitely say that there's Australian legalism at play here, you know, that the role of the judge is very much a statutory interpretation and confined in that way. It's quite a different method of constitutional interpretation to say what you get in some of the European countries, where you really do get this emphasis on principles. So I think the strategic behaviour point is also really interesting. I'm not a political scientist, and I try to avoid those questions because I think that they go to sociological questions that I really didn't explore in this book because I didn't have those methods to hand. I think one of the examples that's often given from the Pacific of a potential failure of strategic litigation is in relation to the Fiji coup. So that coup in 2006 was challenged in court based on a previous challenge to a previous coup, which was successful, right? And in 2006 and in 2009, the Court of Appeal said, well, that coup was illegal. you have to stop. The military government, doesn't have legitimacy. It's not legal. Those judges handed down their decision and flew out, the same day. And of course, the next day, the government said, well, we're abrogating the Constitution, and judges are dismissed. So the question, which is always a difficult one to answer, is, well, what if those judges were local judges? Would they have decided that differently? How would have that played out? And of course, we'll never know. But that's the example that's often given, and one that I really couldn't find a convincing answer to. But I do think that sense that foreign judges can just leave while local judges have to stay and deal with the consequences is an important distinction between citizen and non-citizen in this regard.
That's true.
Thank you, Anna. There's just one more question in the chat for you from Helga Molbeck-Stenzi. And it says that your argument has an important colonial dimension, and whether you believe your argument about localization would be different in a different setting. So, for example, there is a debate about the relationship between judicial independence, universality, and localization with regards to international human rights law, where the strongest voices often come from former colonizing rather than former colonized states.
I think that's a really great point. Thank you, Helga, for bringing it up. I subscribe to the kind of view that rights protection is often most effective if it's localized in some way, that not to subscribe to the view that, rights are a Western concept that have no meaning in other contexts. I don't think that at all. But there is a sense in which rights and law itself have to be made to fit and to be made understandable in a local context. So in the book, this kind of comes out in a few different cases. There's a very famous freedom of religion case in Chuvalu, which was decided by foreign judges and raised this issue very prominently. And the court, the majority of the court kind of came down on the side of upholding the individual right to freedom of religion over the customary authority to prohibit the establishment of a church on an island. And I use that case to kind of show some of the issues that come out and really the difficult position that judges are placed in, right? How do you adjudicate this? Rights adjudication is difficult enough without this additional layer of colonialism and post-colonialism to negotiate. The other example, I think, where this comes out in the book is in the very notion of judicial independence and impartiality. And I think that, I was always a little bit worried about this claim that, we need foreign judges because local judges are too embedded in the community. They've got too many relatives. They can never be impartial because the community is so small. And I've always felt uncomfortable with that argument. And in the book, I try to explain, that might be a problem in other states, in other legal systems, but in the Pacific, they've really worked hard to define judicial independence and impartiality in a way that acknowledges that, but says, a judge can still be independent. And if they can't, they can recuse themselves, but it's still possible to be a judge in that circumstance. You don't always need to import a foreigner. So I think it's a really important point. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna. I think we have a couple more minutes for one very quick, very brief question, if anyone is interested to ask. Or if not, maybe I can ask one question. Because I'm thinking along the lines of what Erin said, what next? I'm thinking about, we've spoken a lot about the timing for engagement of foreign judges, but what about disengagement? When do we disengage? Or even do we have to disengage at some point? And if we do disengage, what is how do we say that? What are the rules of disengagement? What is the exit strategy? And so on. Have you thought of that?
Very much. Yeah, no, that's a really good point. I have thought of that.
That's your next project, I guess.
Potentially. And I think, well, the Pacific can tell us something about that. I think African countries can as well, and probably the Caribbean too. I just don't know as much about them. So it's a difficult question because, and it came to the fore in Papua New Guinea in particular, and more recently in Samoa. That there are legitimate desire to localize the courts, but how do you do it, and how do you do it in a way that's sustainable and doesn't cause too much disruption? And if it's true, and in many cases it is true, that you have a shortage of local citizens who are willing and able to take up judicial appointment, you need somebody to provide judicial services in the meantime. So I think it's probably a gradual process, but there are examples where it's not been a gradual process at all, where it's been quite a disruptive one. So in Papua New Guinea in the late 1970s, there was a big dispute between the judges, many of whom were colonial judges, had served in there during colonial times and stayed on into independence, and the executive government. It resulted in the resignation of, I think, 5 of those Australian and foreign judges from the bench, leaving Papua New Guinea with not very many judges at all. And, they hired some more foreign judges, but they also then said, well, it's time to get our own judges, and commenced a process of localisation. So some people have said that maybe that happened too quickly. Admittedly, those people were Australians and judges. I'm not sure if Papua New Guineans themselves agree it would happen too quickly. Maybe it's just the way that it's developed, and it's been sustained, right? So as I noted in the presentation, Papua New Guinea still has a very low proportion of foreign judges, and they're used quite strategically, I think, and they're for particular expertise, particularly in large commercial cases. And things like that. So it's an example of how it could, play out. But I think it's an important point to think about. And my view is it's probably an incremental process. When you try to say, and this is what happened in Samoa, where you try to say all judges must be Samoan from now on, you do run into the concern, which Samoa's judiciary dealt with quite well, especially because it was during a pandemic and a constitutional crisis, have you got enough judges to sit on your Supreme Court and your Court of Appeal without running into the conflict of interest problem there? So it's something to be thought a lot about.
Thank you, Anna, for sharing your thoughts on your amazing book. And thank you for actually agreeing to present in our showcase series. Thank you, Erin. Thank you, Rohit. Thank you, everybody who joined us today. I can just say have a good day, have a good evening, have a good night wherever you are. And needless to say, I guess in our thoughts, we are with our colleagues in Ukraine. Till the next time when my colleague Adai is preparing something in Spanish for you.
Fantastic. Thank you, everybody.
Anna, Maha, thank you again, and looking
Thank
forward
you
to
so
the handbook
much.
once it comes out. Yeah.
Oh gosh, yeah, that's for Constance. It's taking a long time, but it will get there eventually. Yes.
Like
definitely.
cats, right?
Thank you so much. I realized I didn't get to all your questions, but they were really, really.
This was perfect. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, Maya, so much. That was brilliant. Yeah, was it okay? Yeah.
It was perfect.
Good.
I think I should stop recording.
Sorry.